Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is John Holika. I'm a professor of visual arts here, and I'm one of the organizers of this teach-in. Teach-in is being organized, it's a year-long teach-in. It's being organized by a coalition. We call ourselves the Gaza USD Coalition. It's a coalition of faculty and alumni. And we started preparing events for this teach-in not too long after the October 7 attack and the horrific destruction in Gaza that followed that. And the purpose of our teaching has been to help inform our community and inform ourselves of narratives, of histories, of ways to look at those histories and current events that are not commonly presented in the public media. So we've learned a lot. This will be our 11th or 12th event in the teach-in, and we have two more coming up. Tonight's event is Just War and Oxymoron. Will be a real interesting event. I'm going to introduce Rico, our moderator, and he will introduce the panelists. But I also would like to mention that next week, the 25th, on Thursday from 6 to 7:30 p.m., there's a panel discussion that will be held in Solomon Hall, in Maher Hall 204, I believe. That's called Contested Truth and Counter Narratives. And it's being organized by Dr. Diane Keeling from the Communication Studies, and will include Dr. Susie Babka. I almost called you Susie Gablik, who's a well-known art critic, and Antonietta Mercado and Bahar Davari. And I hope you'll join us for that one next week. I want to begin, before I introduce Rico, by acknowledging that we are standing on the land of the Kumeyaay people, and by acknowledging the fact that wherever we stand in this country, we are on the land of Native people as guests, and hopefully humble guests. And I want to just briefly introduce Rico Monge, Dr. Rico Monge, or the Reverend Dr. Rico Monge. I didn't know the Reverend part until recently. The Reverend Dr. Rico Monge, who's a professor of theology and religious studies here in USD. And he's also the deacon of the Antiochian Greek Orthodox Church. And he's worked for a number of years with Christian Palestinian parishes. Dr. Monge is working currently, is almost completing a book on the various forms of fascism that are rising across the world, and on the connection of those various forms of fascism to religion, and religion as a tool that facilitates but also can challenge those forms of fascism. So I'm very much looking forward to reading his book when it is published. I'm sure he is as well. So I just hope, I really want to thank our community for being part of this teaching. This has been a very challenging process on many levels. Not only challenging to make, it's actually been an instrument of sanity, for me at least, to work on this project. But challenging because across this country, there's a lot of efforts, a lot of pressure to suppress voices that want to speak about the experiences of Palestinians. And I think I want to applaud USD for never challenging our effort. They've given us the space. They've let us use the printing machines to circulate flyers. As a matter of fact, they gave us money to pay some of our speakers last semester. So I'm grateful for their effort to allow this teaching to occur, to allow our community to learn and to engage in this extended process of learning. And I really am grateful for you all being here. So Rico, you're on.
Thank you, John. And I can't be thankful enough to John for kind of being our de facto fearless leader in herding the cats that are academics to actually do something focused and sustained like this. I am honored to be able to introduce two of my esteemed colleagues, even though one of them no longer works here with us. He will forever be a colleague. They are both professional theologians and specifically, they both specialize in ethics. While Dr. Emily Reimer-Barry is mainly working within the Catholic tradition of theological ethics, and then also its intersection with feminist ethics. And Dr. the Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, who's now a pastor at the Loft, which is a United Methodist church close to UCLA in Westwood, correct? He specializes, from a Protestant perspective, in ethics as well, and with a particular emphasis on Black theology, both of which, feminist theology and Black theology, it's worth also remembering they themselves kind of grow out of or are grounded in liberation theology. So there's a nice nexus here that we will be talking about. And while I am, as John said, a reverend and something of a theologian myself, I'll mainly be operating here in a role of the kind of work he talked about that I'm working on, which is which undergirds liberation theology, namely the liberatory thought of Karl Marx and a lot of what they're called other types of socialist theorists. So that's what I will be hoping to facilitate, a nice lively discussion of these interconnections afterwards. So anyway, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Emily Reimer-Barry to give us her talk on Is Just War an Oxymoron?
Thank you. I think I can use this one, right? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I want to join Rico in thanking John for your extraordinary leadership, and it's really an honor to share the stage with Rico and Christopher, my esteemed colleagues. Thanks also to my students who showed up tonight. So I'm the one who suggested the title for our panel is Just War an Oxymoron? And the question invites us to consider some very basic categories. What do we mean by justice? How could killing ever be described as just or justified? Some will, of course, argue that the phrase just war does not make sense. They will say that it puts together two ideas that don't belong together, much like diet donut or jumbo shrimp or exact estimate or unbiased opinion. These folks have a point. War is cruelty, as General Sherman wrote in defense of the destruction of Atlanta. Robert McNamara explains that in the fog of war, making clear ethical decisions is supremely challenging. How can the fog of war ever lead to just action? Theologians have for centuries wrestled with the challenge of holding together both the idea that human life is sacred and that killing is sometimes permissible. This does indeed seem contradictory. So the goal of my presentation is to walk you through the main ideas of just war theory, suggest some relevance to the war in Gaza, and invite you to reflect on where you stand on these issues and why. I will not resolve the problem of human sinfulness, the problem of violence in human history, or provide a neat and tidy evaluation of ongoing conflicts. But I hope that this provides a good starting point for a vibrant discussion of the ideals and challenges of the just war tradition. The Judeo-Christian tradition relies in part on divine revelation contained in sacred scriptures. And the Bible contains many different stories of violence, including interpersonal, familial, state violence, and examples of holy war, war waged for religious reasons. A central commitment of Christians is discipleship, that is, following Jesus. Jesus was a first-century Jew who lived in the context of the Roman Empire in and around Jerusalem. Jesus was a pacifist. For the first 4 centuries of Christianity, pacifism was the norm. So in many ways, it is not only anachronistic, but absurd to ask the question, who would Jesus kill? Jesus modeled justice through his advocacy for peace and peacemaking, his healing miracles that demonstrated care for the sick, his inclusion in table fellowship with so-called sinners, and his countercultural friendship with women and shared leadership with women. Jesus modeled outrage at the exploitation of the poor. Jesus had the courage to speak truth to power, and he taught his followers to turn the other cheek and love your enemies and forgive 70 times, 7 times. Jesus was put to death in an act of state-sanctioned violence. So what happened? In the 4th century, St. Augustine, a North African bishop, began to justify the use of force when it supports a just cause, is used with right intention, and has been legitimated by a competent authority. In the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas expanded Augustine's analysis, defending both the human person's natural inclination of self-defense and suggesting that states can also act in self-defense. Aquinas explained that state violence should always be a last resort. One way of thinking about this is to reflect on the parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus told. There, Jesus explained the importance of the Samaritan taking care of the wounded man who had been beaten and left to die. But imagine how Jesus would have told the story differently if the Samaritan had come upon the man being beaten. Must a Good Samaritan in such a situation simply use the power of persuasion? Or should he sacrifice his own body to save the man being beaten? Should he make a human shield using his body? Or can he use proportionate force to protect the wounded man while seeking to disrupt the conflict? These are the kinds of questions that Christian thinkers continue to reflect upon. In situations as varied as medical ethics, immigration policy and border patrol, policing, and the role of the military in warfare. Since the 4th century, the natural right of self-defense articulated by Augustine and Aquinas has significantly shaped a Catholic theological approach to war and peacemaking. Catholic theologian John Courtney Murray explains that in a Roman Catholic ethos of war, there is a will to peace, which in the extremity bears within itself a will to enforce the precept of peace by arms. But this will to arms is a moral will, for it is identical to a will to justice. Lisa Soul Cahill makes this more intelligible by summarizing thus. In the Roman Catholic tradition, there may be a presumption against war, but it is considerably qualified by the expectation that there will be necessary and inevitable exceptions which reason demands, which are therefore clearly justified. Moreover, there is a strong assumption that Christian moral responsibility entails responsibility for the evolution of events in history towards the common good. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about a description of the just war tradition. But it's important to say from the outset that Catholics don't have consensus today. We could identify 3 different positions that are held, both today and in Christian history, though this risks oversimplification. So as you'll see on the slide, one is pacifism, a refusal to resort to violence as a means of settling disputes. I said already that Jesus was a pacifist. Contemporary examples include Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Dan Bergen, and Pope Francis. If you identify as a pacifist, you are in good company for sure. The second is just war, which contends that war, although regrettable, is sometimes justified, but only under certain conditions and according to certain means. And the third is holy war, war waged because God commands it or for other religious reasons. Increasingly today, we see Christian nationalism in the U.S. taking up the rhetoric of holy war. And in the Christian tradition, the Crusades are certainly a clear example of this thinking. But I'll not be focusing on these ideologies in my limited time tonight. In his book, Who Would Jesus Kill?, Catholic theologian Mark Allman presents a spectrum of Christian positions. So you can see those on the slide here. And this for some time has been a useful teaching tool for me. For full disclosure, I place myself somewhere between Biden and the Pope. So Biden is representing political realism and the Pope absolute pacifism, and I place myself between just peacemaking and just war. So let me walk you through the traditional categories of just war. If you have a handout, this will make it easier to follow. And there are plenty of extras. If you haven't gotten one yet, you can just kind of signal. Thanks. So there are three categories of the just war tradition. These include the criteria for going to war, use ad bellum, the rules for in war, use in bello, and increasingly use post bellum. For a war to be declared just in the just war theory, all criteria must be met. In order to justify going to war, we start with the goal for the action that's taken. So number one, just cause. A war is legitimate if waged in self-defense, to protect the innocent, in defense of human rights, or to regain what has been wrongfully seized. Two is legitimate authority. The use of force is permissible if a legitimate political authority, such as Congress, Parliament, President, depending on the governing rules, engages in due process and publicly declares war. Number three is right intention. The ultimate end must be to secure a just and lasting peace. Right intention means that you are doing this for the right reason. Last resort, the fourth, means that all reasonable, peaceful alternatives to war have been fully exhausted. This could mean sanctions or other diplomatic efforts. It means that it's your last resort because you've tried everything else and it didn't work. The next one is probability of success. War cannot be justified if it will have no reasonable chance of success, because it would be futile acceptance of death. So one should avoid futile conflict that will only lead to suffering if it doesn't have a positives that outweigh it, which brings us to proportionality. So proportionality means you're weighing values and disvalues. Macro proportionality means that the damage inflicted and the costs incurred must be proportionate to the good expected to come from it in the total war that you're envisioning. And we'll see proportionality come up again. Okay, what about the rules within war? Once war has been declared, let's assume we've got all of these principles met. When we're trying to evaluate rules of war, the use in bello principles are what we would invoke. The first is discrimination. Discrimination means that you are distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. So it means combatants are soldiers and the like. Non-combatants include civilians. So you cannot directly, that means intentionally, target, in a sense, civilians. The next is making that same discrimination with regard to your targets. So legitimate versus illegitimate targets. You must distinguish between military targets and infrastructure necessary for civilian life. So you cannot directly, that means intentionally, attack water supplies, electrical grids, hospitals, schools, and other infrastructure that's needed for non-combatants' flourishing lives. So you can never directly target life-sustaining infrastructure. The next one forbids acts that are deemed mala in se, which means evil in itself. Another language or term you sometimes hear is intrinsically evil, or acts that are intrinsically evil. You cannot employ methods that are evil in themselves. It's hard to find an accurate list that multiple ethicists share of this sometimes, but I think there's broad consensus here that some of those means mala in se include genocide, rape as a weapon of war, torture, or use of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. And that's because those weapons are by nature indiscriminate, disproportionate, and intrinsically evil. The next is the right to surrender. Enemy combatants can surrender and then must be treated as prisoners of war, not as combatants. And then again, proportionality comes up in these particular criteria as micro-proportionality, which means not only in the entirety of the conflict, as you're weighing values and disvalues, does it need to be proportional, but also in every particular act within the conflict itself. So you can only use the amount of force necessary to achieve your just objective and no more. Christian theologians have expanded to add a new category, use post bellum, and in particular, the work of Tobias Winwright and Mark Allman deserves recognition here. The use post bellum rules require establishing structures of justice and economic and political conditions that can enable a population to thrive. So it means after you've declared war, after you've engaged in war, then you come back to the table and say, did we meet our objective of creating a lasting and just peace? So post-bellum returns to that initial just cause from the first set of criteria and asks, what do we need to do to make this happen? So that must include a process of restorative justice that requires opportunities for perpetrators to account for wrongdoing, to apologize, and to create post-war settlement agreements. It means punishment so that leaders are held accountable for war crimes after a formal judicial process. It means restoration, which includes rebuilding of society, security and just policing, political reform. It means rebuilding of infrastructure, rebuilding of roads, bridges, grids for power, economic recovery, agricultural investment, and the ecological cleanup that can make it possible for you to grow crops again, social rehabilitation, cleaning up of landmines and hazardous waste, and more. Invoking the just war tradition is not an end of an argument, but rather it becomes the beginning of a collective deliberation. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, after describing the principles of the just war tradition, explains the importance of prudence, which means practical wisdom. And I quote, "The evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belongs to the prudential judgment of those who have the responsibility for the common good." A problem, however, is that one person's prudential judgment may differ from her neighbor's prudential judgment. The method of the just war tradition necessitates collective responsibility for discerning and willing the good. It does not suppose a kind of blind faith in political leaders, but rather demands that leaders sincerely listen, engage in principled discernment and debate, and articulate the rationale for use of deadly force. When a population does not find such an argument convincing, citizens have an obligation to advocate for a change in policies or politicians. In other words, the just war tradition assumes a kind of messy and dialogical process, including public discourse about the sacred value of human life and the realities of conflict that must be navigated in a principled and just way. The Israel-Palestine war provides much evidence of the tragedy of war and the realities of horrific violence. There are many ways that we could place the criteria of the just war tradition in conversation with the current conflict. Consider these three as a start. So, right intention. A right intention aims at a just and lasting peace. A lasting peace is not possible unless certain standards of basic justice are secure. Proportionality, macro and micro, involves weighing the known harms that war inflicts against the harms prevented. The use of force must be proportionate to meet the just objective. So no more force than is necessary to complete the mission. Means mala in se. You cannot engage in intrinsically evil acts, genocide, ethnic cleansing, rape as a tool of war, biological warfare, torture, kidnapping of children, and so forth. The Hamas terrorist attacks of October 7th, 2023 should be explicitly condemned. These premeditated and coordinated attacks involved direct killing, taking of hostages, and reported sexual violence against hostages. Such violence should be condemned in the strongest possible terms. Israel's response has been overwhelmingly disproportionate. Recent figures published by Al Jazeera indicate that at least 33,899 Gaza residents have been killed, including more than 13,800 children and 76,664 injured since October 7th. IDF tactics of war have included targeting of infrastructure that is essential to civilians, homes, schools, hospitals. 60% of residential buildings in Gaza have been damaged. 80% of commercial facilities are damaged. 267 places of worship are damaged. 11 of 35 hospitals are partially functional. 83% of groundwater wells are not operational. More than 80 school buildings have been damaged. Where can civilians go to protect themselves and their families? The humanitarian crisis is real and is worsening. Such a situation does not reflect what Christian theologians describe as a peace that comes from good order. Acts of war motivated by revenge, seizure of land, ethnic bias, and geopolitical domination cannot be justified. It's also important to say that security is not the same as peace. While it's difficult to identify a state's intention, since intention is subjective, it is possible to condemn state actions that undermine a lasting peace. Peace is not the absence of war. Peace is the fruit of right relationship. A lasting peace means people have the goods necessary to live a flourishing life. And let me be clear, on October 6th, 2023, residents of Gaza were in a more stable situation than they currently face, but we would not describe that situation as a just peace in this framework either. A more holistic investigation of the just war tradition's wisdom would require that we look not only at events since October 7th, but also in the 75 plus years prior. All actions should aim at a lasting peace. This is the work of politics and world building. It requires the capacious inclusion and practices of pragmatic solidarity. So to be more direct, we should clearly condemn actions that violate the rules of war, such as targeting of non-combatants, destruction of homes, hospitals, and water supplies, and disproportionate use of deadly force. I'm also horrified by the use of memes mala in se. While elsewhere I've been critical of the category of intrinsic evil in Catholic theological ethics, I find the condemnation of genocide, torture, rape, and mass starvation as helpful in this context. The WHO reports that 16.5% of children under 5 are acutely malnourished, and 400,000 people are at risk for famine and waterborne illness because the Israeli government has been blocking food, aid, and fuel. The UN reports evidence of sexual humiliation and sexual assault and is demanding intervention to protect the Palestinian population from genocide. These are grave and serious concerns, and more pressure should be put on Israel to agree to a ceasefire and move towards a political solution. A ceasefire would not be the end, but a new beginning of a long and messy process of building a lasting peace. As you've probably seen already, invoking the just war tradition does not lead to neat and tidy conclusions, but rather points to more work that must be accomplished to secure a just and lasting peace. Mark Allman explains, and this is a quote from his book on the slide, Who Would Jesus Kill? I also have some other good books up there in case you need to add something to your Amazon wish list. The just war theory is not a complete ethical theory for dealing with war. As a teleological theory, it simply provides a way for thinking and talking about the morality and immorality of using deadly force. It does not yield definitive answers to real-life problems. In other words, it doesn't tell us what to do in a particular situation. Instead, it helps us think and talk about warfare so we can discern what ought to be done when conflicts arise. The just war theory provides useful categories and norms, but these must be applied to specific and variable conflicts. That's why theologians emphasize the importance of practical wisdom or prudence. I want to suggest, too, that we have an obligation to build empathy across the various identities and lived experiences that divide us. In the rhetoric of war, we too often dehumanize the other. We should develop the moral imagination and empathy that enables us to seek to understand complex issues from multiple perspectives, and that encourages us to see tragic any loss of life, to see as tragic any loss of life. And finally, while the focus of my presentation has been the just war theory, it's important to name the way that critics of the just war tradition point out its limitations. Pope Francis, building on the work of his predecessors, and this is on the back of the slide or the handout if you're interested. So Pope Francis, building on his predecessors, has moved official church teachings towards pacifism and away from a just war framework. In Fratelli Tutti, which was published right before the US presidential election in 2020, the Pope explains that the end of politics is the common good. End meaning like the purpose of politics. With regard to war, the Pope is suspicious of the way that just war principles have been used to justify violence. He says, war can easily be chosen by invoking all sorts of allegedly humanitarian, defensive, or precautionary excuses, and even resorting to the manipulation of information. In recent decades, every single war has been ostensibly justified. We can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it's very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war. Again, that was from Pope Francis. Which brings me back to Ullmann's spectrum. So Pope Francis speaks prophetically in his defense of pacifism. He offers what some might say a more pacifist extremist position, which, as the leader of 1.3 billion Catholics around the world, is significant. A Catholic politician like Joe Biden is in a different kind of role. And while sometimes drawing on the principles of just war, he also invokes claims of political realism and nationalism, that is, attention to the interests of the state in his role as president. So I find myself between them, in that messy middle between a just peacemaking perspective and a just war perspective. Key claims that resonate with my position are that the use of force is regrettable, tragic, and sinful, and yet in some cases, deadly force is justifiable in self-defense, to protect the vulnerable, to achieve a lasting and just peace. The theological anthropology that underlies this is the claim that humans are broken creatures in a sinful world, but we still have a responsibility for limiting harm, protecting the vulnerable, and securing a lasting peace. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share this framework, and I look forward to the dialogue.
looking at my notes here, and I've gotten, ooh, there we go, sufficiently old enough that I need to make this font larger. So I was like, it's far away. I think I'm gonna have to do something about this. Perfect. That's a little bit better for me. Well, first I want to thank you all for having me here. Thank Rico for inviting me to come back, and Dr. Reimer-Barry for her excellent lecture. For those of you who don't know, I was a professor here for, I don't know, like 7-8 years, something like that. I don't know. It was a while. And I have decided to transition to a different career. As was said, I'm ordained a Methodist elder, and I currently serve as the lead pastor of the Loft congregation, which is a part of Westwood Methodist Church. I did this for a few reasons. As you will be able to tell tonight, towards the last few years of teaching here, my lectures began to sound more and more sermonic. And I realized that perhaps this was my heart telling me something about what I was actually called to do. But more specifically, I began to feel deeply compelled to act out my faith in ways that will push beyond the boundaries of academia in the messy context of lived reality. And so this is what I'm going to talk about tonight. I am going to talk about my perspectives and the way I've begun to think about the war in Gaza distinctly from a Christian perspective, and the same ways in which I've talked about it with my friends and colleagues in my congregation. So I want to just spend a few more minutes situating myself before I get into all of this. I am a pastor, and I work at a very intentionally interracial Protestant church about 2 miles from UCLA. It's interracial, it is intercultural, it is reconciling, which in our tradition means it's queer affirming. And so the choir you see on the bottom picture is our gospel choir, which is predominantly queer people of color. I say all this to let you know that the way I think about bodies and the realities of human sacredness has been deeply influenced by my experience not only in this space, but my understanding and reading of Scripture. And to be fair, I grew up in a more kind of moderate Christianity, and this was something I've continued to grow and work through. The reason I would say I approach Scripture and I approach things with a particular kind of what might be called a hermeneutic of suspicion is because if you are Black and you are Christian, you are or should be deeply aware of the ways in which the Bible can be manipulated to justify your oppression. For over 280 years in America, people used Scripture, Christians used Scripture to justify enslavement and the dehumanization of Black people. So one only has to have that decent awareness to know that this means that when we approach matters of faith, matters of Scripture, we must do so with caution and with clarity so that we might actually do no harm. Curiosity continued to lead me to where I am today, and it has allowed me to, I think, grow towards a more closer reflection of what it means to follow the religion of Jesus. The title of my talk today is The Myth of Redemptive Violence, Just War, Pacifism, and Nonviolent Resistance. I would say I stand in the tradition of people like Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King in advocating for nonviolence because of my theo-ethical commitment that all creation bears the markings of the sacred and that all human beings bear the image of God. So to harm a human being is, in fact, to harm God. My position tonight should be clear. I believe that if you are a Christian, you should find the idea that a war could be just as an impossibility. The religion of Jesus is a religion of nonviolent resistance, and that individual Christians and our denomination's failure to adhere to the principles of nonviolence described by Jesus in the Gospels are an example of how the lure of nation-state sanctioned power marginalizes the witness that Christians are called to bear in the world. I believe something inside all of us longs for security. Something inside all of us longs for stability and for peace. However, human history reveals that we tend to try to meet this need through force. Violence, then, is all too often seen as a tool for peace rather than an obstacle that prevents peace. Jesus' spiritual path of radical compassion reveals to us a pathway towards peace beyond the myth that violence has the power to redeem or save us. To be sure, I use the phrase Jesus' spiritual path of radical compassion to signal a distinction between Christianity as it is commonly practiced and the religion of Jesus as we see it lived out in the Gospels. I will discuss the shift from what we might call the religion of Jesus to Constantinian Christianity in due time. I would also note that even after his own death and resurrection, as we read in the Gospel of John, Jesus still whispers peace. Literally, the first words he speaks to his disciples after he encounters them are words of peace, not once, but over and over again, I suspect speaking directly to the fears and insecurities that arise when choosing peace over domination. In a world that so strongly lacked peace, again, peace are some of the first words that we hear Jesus speak. And I want to say a little bit about that. In John 20, verses 19 and 21, after his resurrection, we read that it was the first day of the week. That evening, while the disciples were behind closed doors because they were afraid of the Jewish authorities, Jesus came and stood among them, and he said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. When the disciples saw the Lord, they were filled with joy. He said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father sent me, so I am sending you." Now, over 2,000 years later, we find ourselves in a world that once again lacks peace. Peace with ourselves, lacks peace with our neighbors, peace with our planet, and an inner peace. What does peace look like? What does peace feel like? How do we hold peace? How do we share it? How might we set peace free? Well, one of the challenges that we face is that some of the roots of the Christian religion are built upon what theologian and biblical scholar Walter Wink would describe as the myth of redemptive violence. We see this evidence in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 17 and 21, where it reads, "If anyone kills another person, they must be executed. Someone who kills an animal may make amends for it, a life for a life. If someone injures a fellow citizen, they will suffer the same injury they inflicted. Broken bone for a broken bone, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The same injury the person inflicted on the other will be inflicted on them. Someone who kills an animal must make amends for it, but whoever kills a human being must be executed. There is but one law on this matter for you, immigrant or citizen alike, because I am the Lord your God." The myth of redemptive violence sits at the very foundation of the laws of proportional justice that we just read in the ancient Israelite religion and what they were told to practice. By redemptive violence, I mean the idea that somehow justice, goodness, and peace can be brought about through violence or violent means. The idea that violence has redeeming qualities, or the idea that violence can, in fact, be good. Indeed, within this framework, violence becomes salvific. Violence is understood as a means of acquiring salvation because we internalize the belief that violence, when done by the right people and for the right reasons, will save us. Wink calls it a myth in part because he is gesturing towards its mythic beginnings, which can be found in the creation narratives of some of the oldest organized religious traditions in ancient Near East, what he refers to as Babylonian religion. In stark contrast to the two creation narratives we find in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in the Hebrew Bible, the creation myths of Babylonian religion are inherently violent. In this myth, one god, always a male, kills another god, always a female, and uses the remains of her body to create the earth. This myth finds its genesis, its origin, in the myth of Tiamat and Marduk. And this Tiamat is often framed in later time as a dragon. And so this is Marduk killing Tiamat. Then he spreads her remains out to create the heavens, to distinguish between the heavens and the earth from the fresh water and salt water. In this creation myth, there is no such thing as the problem or evil that we talk about in our Christianity classes on campus, or the mystery of evil, as some of you may refer to it as, because evil is a primordial fact. Evil just is. The basics of this myth influence religions in Syria, Egypt, Greece, Roman religion, Celtic religion in Britain, and religions in India. And as the text in Leviticus shows, this myth is powerful and pervasive. So we shouldn't be surprised to find remnants of this myth, the tentacles of this myth, in ancient Israelite religion as well, especially given the intercultural exchanges that would have taken place for trade during that period. To be sure, we see this myth in contemporary society today. In TV and film, we see superheroes or vigilantes operate within this myth. They use their power, their violence, for the sake of good, or so we are supposed to believe. And yet, it often goes unnoticed in our analysis of these shows or these films that a key part of their plotline is to promote a profound distrust of democratic institutions and democracy itself. These films portray the general public at best as fearful and at worst as incompetent, unable to work together for the common good. Given this framing, the myth of redemptive violence propagates itself as a fundamental necessity. We need people who will use force, violent force if necessary, to save us from ourselves. Again, within this myth, within these films, violence becomes salvific. Violence is the only thing that can save us. To be sure, the general public is portrayed as good people, even if they are infantilized. The bad people, who are often men, often people of color, these bad people are supposed to be obviously bad. Indeed, they are to be seen as barely human, subhuman, such that their death does not trigger our conscience. And this is key for the propagation and continuation of this myth. It is premised on the idea that we fail to love. In this sense, the myth of redemptive violence also teaches us to locate all that is or could potentially be evil outside of ourselves. In this way, the primary theological language that we use to examine ourselves as Christians, the language of sin, is therefore casted upon others who are deemed evil, sinful, and worthy of punishment for the actions they have committed. Now, I know that talk about sin doesn't often find its way into academic lectures. I know that some of you, due to your own religious experiences, one might even say religious trauma, may be tuning out what I have been saying so far. So I'm going to invite you to stay with me for a few more minutes, and I promise it won't hurt too much. I also want to invite you to remind you that as you continue to engage people about the situation, the war in Gaza, that many of these people use Christian theology and Christian thinking, as Dr. Reimer-Barry and I are discussing tonight, to develop their own particular framework, their justifications for this war. Lastly, I want to remind you that the topic we are discussing today is not merely academic. We are talking about bodies. We are talking about people. We are talking about flesh. War and suffering are not abstract theories. They are acted out upon bodies. And I think we forget that because so many of us have not had to suffer as these people are suffering. Therefore, theological language that describes how we fail to live up to our theological commitments that impact bodies that are suffering is critical. We must interact with the language of sin. Following the work of Roman Catholic scholar Jim Keenan, I define sin fundamentally as a failure to bother to love. This definition is consistent with the way Jesus describes sin in the Gospels. In the Gospels, sin is often attributed not to those who obviously did something wrong, but rather to those who did not bother to love. So, for instance, you see in the biblical text, these men were going to stone a woman for committing adultery, as if someone commits adultery by themselves. I don't know where that man was, but clearly, you know, as far as I understand adultery, maybe I got a fundamental misunderstanding, but it takes two people, right? And yet, Jesus prevents this murder. As Dr. Reimer-Barry mentioned, when we talk about the story of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite who step aside from the injured man on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, what Jesus critiques them on in this parable is that they failed to bother to love. In this way, we often experience our sin as a kind of self-serving illusion where we reframe our failures to love in ways that make us look like heroes to ourselves. Like the wealthy people Jesus critiques in the Gospels, we hoard things like money and we call it prudence. Like the priest and the Levite, we avoid entanglement with someone else's misfortune and call it staying safe. We deny federal and state benefits to poor children and say that we are motivating them to work to earn their money. We eliminate federal policies such as affirmative action by pretending that updated anti-discrimination laws can undo the internalized racial ideologies that normalize a racial caste system that operated in our country for 80% of our history. We pass anti-trans legislation to keep kids safe, when in fact it is those very children who are suffering and committing suicide because to them death feels better than a life where you are not allowed to live and be yourself. Queer youth are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than straight youth and cisgendered youth. 1.8 million young people between the ages of 13 and 24 attempt suicide each year. 1 every 45 seconds because they are struggling with the reality of their sexuality in light of their community. This is sin as an illusion. We build walls to help keep out immigrants and we call it patriotism. We build more bombs, guns, and weapons of mass destruction than anywhere in the world and we call it self-defense. These self-serving and corporate illusions are rooted in fear and rooted in the myth of redemptive violence. And so the question we must turn to now is why? I know this is so funny. I know it's just a combination of it, so I couldn't help it. I had to make it white Jesus too, just so you know. I did that on purpose. I was like, only white Jesus would do that. Why is this myth so pervasive? Why is it so pervasive that it found its way into the Christian sacred text and to Christian traditions? I agree with Wink in his assertion that the myth is so pervasive and still so influential because it offers the promise of salvation, that we will be saved from experiencing violence, or at least the worst kinds of violence, if we identify with and uphold the dominant and dominator culture of those who are in power. People who follow this path believe that if you follow the rules of a dominant and dominator culture, if you uphold their values, if you do your best to normalize violence, then perhaps you will not be on the receiving end of said violence. And for those who seek to acquire power within this system of domination, they follow the teachings of the myth of redemptive violence because they hope that they will be able to be on the giving rather than the receiving end of structural violence. By siding with the dominant and dominator culture, you are encouraged to believe in your inherent goodness, such that all evil, all sin is found outside of you. The myth of redemptive violence feels good. It is a part of the logics that we might often refer to as saviorism, in part because it's what we know. We've been told that it's our job as Americans to go save people, that it's your job, some of you who are socialized as white, to go save people. It feels good because it feels normal, because we believe we are called to bring a certain kind of salvation to the world. Given the pervasive nature of the myth of redemptive violence, perhaps you are wondering if there's anything we can do to escape its grasp. I believe there is. There is something we can do, but I want to be honest with you. It is difficult. It is radical. And pretty much everyone who has taught their communities a way of living that pushed against this myth has died a most painful death. Indeed, many Christians, those of you identified as Christians, just spent a Friday evening a few weeks ago sitting with the reality of Jesus's crucifixion. It's important, I think, for us to remember why Jesus was crucified. When you read the Gospels, you see that he didn't have what you might call a strong legal case against him. He was helping people. He was healing people. He was organizing people. He was loving people. He was teaching them to love themselves and to love their enemies. He wasn't doing anything illegal enough to warrant crucifixion. And yet, I believe that among the reasons that he was crucified, that he was lynched, as Black theologian James Cone would say, is that Jesus was teaching a path towards salvation outside of the myth of redemptive violence. He was breaking the myth of redemptive violence down. He was teaching salvation through love, salvation through compassion, and solidarity with creation in ways that dismantled the boundaries of the dominant and dominator culture of his time. He was teaching them a new way, and he outlines this new way in Matthew chapter 5 through 7, what Christians often refer to and call the Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, he is speaking against the very Levitical law that we read earlier. It says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you that you must not oppose those who want to hurt you. If people slap you on your right cheek, you must turn the left cheek to them as well. When they wish to haul you to court and take your shirt, let them have your coat too. When they force you to go 1 mile, go with them too. Give to those who ask and don't refuse those who wish to borrow from you." Now, these verses have been used by some to argue that Jesus was a pacifist, meaning that he taught his followers to submit to evil and that submitting to evil was the will of God. However, one only has to read verses 39 through 42 to see that this conclusion, I would argue, falls short, because in these verses, Jesus is describing how his followers should, in fact, resist evil, not passively accept it. Indeed, the Greek word, now my Greek is terrible, so I'm just going to say antistasne. I'm like, that's probably not right, but that's what we're going to go with. Which we translate as not resist in the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, or not oppose in the Common English Version, has militaristic roots. Most of the time when the word was used, it was used to denote counteractive aggression that could be lethal or lethal violence. In short, this word means more than to simply stand against or resist. It means to resist violently. And so biblical scholars such as Walter Wink and others argue that a more accurate translation of verse 39 is that we ought not to repay evil with evil. We are not to mirror evil, because all too often we become what we hate. All too often we become what we hate. The refusal to mirror evil, the refusal to respond to evil in kind is a difficult truth. You see, we become what we hate in that way. The very act of hating something draws us to it and it to us. Since our hate is usually a direct response to an evil done to us, our hate most invariably causes us to respond in the terms already laid down by the enemy. Unaware of what is happening to us, we turn into the very thing we claim to despise and oppose. The ultimate weakness this is a quote from Martin Luther King. Make sure I get that right here. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you cannot murder the hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. So it goes. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. This is from his essay, Where Do We Go From Here? The invitation to not mirror evil is more than just saying that war and violence is bad. It is deeper than that. Violence draws intelligent, rational, decent people into mirroring violence. Before we realize it, we are doing or condoning the dehumanizing acts, and we feel unable to act otherwise. Violence can never stop violence because its very success leads others to imitate it. Paradoxically, violence is most dangerous when it succeeds. This is why The spiritual path of Jesus, the teachings of nonviolent resistance are radical. Historically, too radical for a church that is concerned with maintaining security through coercive power given to it by the nation state. The development of just war criteria that began with Augustine in the 5th century was a capitulation to fear and a desire for a nostalgic past that he imagined existed. This idea for something, a longing for something that was not actually going to be true again and was not ever true. The criteria are commendable, actually, to be fair. But what I want to suggest is that the criteria are not the problem. Rather, it is that the criteria have been subordinated to the myth of redemptive violence. The criteria, which on face value are stringent, are always interpreted loosely. Indeed, in practice, we often just go with our gut to determine if a war feels just or not. Does it feel justy? You know, it's literally kind of like that. None of you, besides Dr. Reimer-Barry, sat down to go through the criteria before coming to your own conclusion. Most wars we have fought, even after development of just war theory, fall into one of these three categories. Actually, we mentioned them earlier. Holy war or crusade. These are wars aimed at the utter subjugation or extermination of an enemy. So you think about the Crusades, or even think about the language of World War I. Political wars of national interest, wars that are not justified by ethical reflection, but by power and politics. So think about Vietnam or the first war with Iraq. Or egocentric wars. And these wars are about the preservation of pride and honor. Think about the second Iraq war or the most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. To practice the religion of Jesus is to opt out of systems of domination. It is to opt out of the myth of redemptive violence. In this way, we can see that the teachings that Jesus taught his followers, the teachings that were so radical that cost him his life, was that true peace can only be attained if we create a new society, a reign of God in his language, or a beloved community in the language of Martin Luther King, that operates outside of the culture of domination and violence that we see today. I argue that this is the framework that Christians should be using when thinking and assessing the war in Palestine. We should be moving beyond the myth of redemptive violence, beyond the binary of just war or pacifism, to Jesus' third way, this nonviolent resistance. We cannot mirror evil, or we will inevitably become the evil that we hate. I argue that Christians cannot support the war in Gaza because the act of war, violence of this nature, is inconsistent with the religion of Jesus we are called to practice. Indeed, it is again, capitulation to the myth of redemptive violence. It signifies our failure to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, to see the image of God in them. It relies on the illogic of dehumanization to create a righteous illusion that normalizes and moralizes the death of innocent lives. This illogic of dehumanization is most expressed in the language that is used by Israeli leaders. Things such as we are fighting human animals, and that we are making Gaza a slaughterhouse, or that we should be erasing the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth. All quotes taken from Israeli government leaders. This is the language of dehumanization. It is the illusion. You create the illusion that you are not killing people, that you are killing things. And when you create this illusion, it allows you to kill without conscience. This does not mean that we dismiss the violence that it was enacted upon Israel by Hamas on October 7th. Rather, I'm arguing that we cannot support the resolution of this attack through military means. Violence begets violence. A Christian perspective on the war in Gaza suggests that we should use nonviolent resistance to urge the American government to use its diplomatic weight to persuade Israel to work towards actually creating a two-state solution that is fair and equitable. Now, some of you have said, I've heard so much about two-state solution. That stuff is never going to happen. Well, let me tell you, one big dilemma that we face in this country is that certain state governments have passed laws that have limited our capacity as citizens to actually put pressure upon Israel to actually do the work that we might believe they ought to do. So, for instance, the divestment movement that began in the early 2000s, that was actually making progress. This movement was framed as anti-Semitic, when in fact it is a movement that was used to persuade South Africa, to push South Africa to dismantle apartheid. So it is okay to do it when it is about pushing a minority of white people to not be racist against black people, but it's not okay in this instance because it deals with the state of Israel. For Christians, I would argue we must use nonviolent resistance and push our elected officials to see the dignity in all human life, including the life of Palestinians, and ensure that innocent people are not starving, that hospitals are functional, that schools are functional. In conclusion, nonviolent resistance is not pacifism, and it is not just war. It is the means by which we ought, as people of faith, as Christians, to create the society that we long to have. It is the framework that we are called to use to push for change through a means that will not recreate the violent society that we do not want to have. It is the only way that we can create sustainable change. Otherwise, we fall victim to mirroring violence, to becoming the evil that we hate. And this will never ultimately work. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to both of you for two just excellent and thought-provoking and very important talks, and with a productive tension, I think, between them. And while I'm going to highlight lots of things that I agree with and stood out to me, I'm also going to be a little bit of the problem, the problem causer, push you all both on a couple of things just to get your thoughts on those. But yeah, I just want to first start off just by saying, some of the things that really stood out to me is just so vitally important. Emily, in your talk, the highlighting of how peace is not the absence of war, right? I think it's one of those things that is just essential for us to look at, and it connects also with what Christopher was talking about, with how much the idea of peace has been weaponized against oppressed peoples over time, leading to the perpetuation of problems. And I also noted the discussion of real politics and of, I believe you used the word world building. Was that? I'm definitely going to draw that out a bit more here too. And I think that was another point of resonance with your talk, Christopher, in terms of thinking about how do we actually create a different world, and this myth of redemptive violence is not that way. It actually keeps the cycle going and reinscribes that sort of thing. And I'm especially also going to look at, actually, when you were talking about it, it made me think of two of my favorite thinkers that I'm actually working on with my book, who, often, despite their own failings and rather lousy politics at times, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. Nietzsche has the quote, "Be careful when doing battle with monsters, lest you become the monster yourself," right? And that one definitely really hit with me as you were talking. And then also in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, where the Elder Zosima, talks about whenever you have the question of whether to take something by force or take it by humble love, to always do so with humble love, because, as he puts it, a humble love is actually a terrifying power. It is something, and he means it in this, like an awe-inspiring power that is so little actually manifested in the world that people do not recognize its power. And I'm going to come back to these, but first I'm going to be a pain in the ass. So, so I guess my first question, to both of you, even though you were in, on that scale that Emily put up, you're both somewhere in between each other, right? I would say I kind of want to problematize the question of religious violence and even the New Testament a little bit. I think, it's hard to find something where one would say, Jesus was violent per se, but, many scholars would perhaps actually disagree with James Cone and say that the reason why Jesus was killed was actually the action in the temple, which in the John narrative includes a description of him fashioning a whip of cords, engaging in property destruction, and at least driving the people out with the threat of said whip. So there's something at least approaching, although even there's something to talk about in the difference between militant action versus violent action, right? But then I would say also, you get Acts chapter 5. Peter, through the power of the Holy Spirit, strikes 2 people dead, Ananias and Sapphira, for being active in class oppression and not in the kind of communitarianism of the early church. And then maybe my last example that I'll give, and that you both give your responses to this, but I think frequently of someone like John Brown, who demonized throughout the Reconstruction and bringing up the whole lost cause of the South sort of thing. But John Brown was a man and his sons motivated by his religious convictions that it was not enough to sit by and just wait for voting and whatever else to end slavery, that taking up arms to keep Kansas a free state, taking up arms to fight and ultimately die at Harper's Ferry, which some historians believe brought about, the Civil War, which finally brought about an end to institutional slavery. I guess I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
I think it's important for us to, when I think about, in the argument I'm making about the myth of redemptive violence and building on Wink's claims about how it's pervasive within religious history, I take that and recognize that even within the Christian text, you're going to find spaces and places where violence is seen as redeeming because humans wrote these texts and that humans are going to entangle themselves within that, right? So while it's sacred, right, it doesn't also mean it's not without a fault, right? I would argue. And I believe, to me, that opens up a way for us to engage the text, recognizing that, I guess, looking at Howard Thurman, he talks about engaging with sacred texts. He's like, it's in the religion because it's true. It's not true because it's in the religion, meaning that these truths that revealed themselves over thousands of years, right, that people have come to realize there's something in here. And I would argue this practices of nonviolent resistance have revealed themselves to be what actually is sustainably effective. And we see instances of violence all throughout the Bible. I mean, you see it all over it. But what I believe and what I would argue is that this doesn't actually further the cause that they're trying to create. It mirrors, like, you become that thing with which you hate. Like, I think this is where mirroring is so helpful. And so if we want to boil it down to put simply, I would say it's about, like, think about, do you have a friend that tells you what you want to hear, or a friend that tells you what you need to hear? Right? And y'all know, I'm seeing them looking at each other like, I don't know, and right, and there's the distinction, right? When you have a friend that tells you what you want to hear, they're not going to necessarily tell you the truth. They're going to tell you what makes you feel good, right? Anything makes you feel good because but a friend that tells you the truth, this person is mirroring you in a way that can allow you to grow. Right. And I think that for me is the key. So it's a matter of human maturity. And so while I do look at the Bible as a sacred text and I draw from it, I also recognize that it has limitations. And so then I look at where have we seen violence and nonviolence be successful, and how has it been sustained? How has that success been sustained throughout history? And so that's why that's why I lean to it. And to be clear, as a Black American, right? Like, I fundamentally recognize, like, if we had, like, there's 15% of us in America, and we ain't the ones with all the guns, right? So I'm not gonna be up here arguing for some kind of violent insurrection, because I'm like, that ain't gonna work out probably well for my people, just because just math, I want the math to math, and if that math to math means that, nonviolence is probably gonna be more strategically effective. Not only strategically effective, but also, again, I believe personally effective, because the last thing I'll say, then Dr. Reimer-Barry, I want to hear your point, or hear what you have to say about this. I have, through parenting, is the last thing I'll say, I've realized the ways in which you cannot use violence to teach your kids to not be violent. You can't. Like, you cannot. And you see it, because you try, it doesn't, because then they just do it around it in different ways. And I'm like, this is true. Like, this is true about what it means to be human. So then the challenge is, how do we overcome this? How do we accept this and accept our entanglement and our interconnectedness? Which for me is a part of what I think part of the reason that I draw on people like Keenan in the Roman Catholic tradition, because I think it so much of it does actually recognize this interconnectedness, right? Now I'm doing something a little different with it, but that's what I appreciate about those scholars, in terms of fundamentally recognizing that.
Brilliant. I really appreciated your presentation, Dr. Carter. I think that one among the many excellent points you made, drawing our attention to the problem of the cycle of violence, is particularly helpful. So I think it was King that you were drawing on, but it's the same in parenting, right? I think you make another excellent point talking about the importance of restorative justice as pedagogy. And a worry of mine in sort of defending principles of the just war tradition is that we don't have enough suspicion of sin, or don't have enough suspicion of the inherent problem of violence. So I think you made a really excellent points. You know what? I don't have a really elaborate response to your sort of probing, and I'm curious about where you'll go next. So instead of spending time thinking through that, I was wondering if we could move on to the next sort of point of tension. Yeah, because I hear you using the language of sort of strategic pacifism versus absolute pacifism, whether pacifism is itself passive, or whether nonviolent resistance is more hopeful. And I guess one of the points of convergence that I saw was that a just peacemaking perspective actually shares so much common ground with what you described as active nonviolence, or active resistance, nonviolent resistance. And I think that there are sort of two different levels. Like, there's one level of interpersonal or personal reconciliation and sort of peacemaking work. But when we're talking about it at the level of the state as an agent, or the state's actions, the ethical questions for me are a little more complex in terms of a just peacemaking perspective. And so I think there's some fruitful tension between, like, the idealism of an absolute pacifism that to me doesn't entirely cohere with sort of the reality of sin, evil that we see in the world, but then also the wisdom of that deep suspicion that violence is going to solve our problems.
So this is what came up. I was thinking about this when you were giving your presentation, Dr. Reimer-Barry. And And it's basically, I guess, to get the cliff notes of this, there's a way in which I believe much of the challenges we have with nation states in terms of acts of aggression are because most nation states are run by men. It's patriarchy. That's fundamentally my belief. So this is how I got here. So during the pandemic, we're all trying to figure out how to teach on Zoom and freaking out and, working from home. And I'm keeping track of all the deaths and everything that's happening around the world. And after, when you get about 2002 and they start compiling this data, what the study showed was that nation states that were led by women had significantly better outcomes in every measurable area, right? Like less death, more people that stay a job, higher GDP, all this other stuff. And it got me thinking about the ways in which patriarchy, how much of that myth of violence is upheld in patriarchy, how much of that, the idea of individualism and bootstrapness is wrapped up in patriarchy and men wanting to show their force. So that last type of war, that ego-centered kind of war. And so a part of me wonders, right, when thinking about just peacemaking and its strategic practicality when it comes to nation states, to what extent are men the problem, right? It's to what extent, I mean, I'm being I am, but I am honest. I'm wow, how much of this is actual patriarchy in the ways in which we have internalized the way we as men should express power rather than in the kind of care ethic often that is socialized within women. And now we can talk about the problems of that as well, right? Because that's a part of patriarchy as well. But I mean, this is what the evidence has shown, right? And so that's something that I've thought about with respect to the effectiveness or ineffectiveness. I've often done the thought experiment. I'm would we have the same kind of problems, right? If the nations were governed more 50-50. I mean, you see what's happening in South Africa with women leadership and how they're pushing, the United Nations and in the International Criminal Court, right? It's just, anyway, I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
I mean,
are men the problem?
yes and no. The socialization towards violence in order to solve problems is not entirely men's problem, right? There are women who use coercive power as well. So I don't want to frame that. I don't want to overstate that, but I think you're onto something in terms of sort of patterns. I think a just peacemaking perspective is hard to wrap our heads around because we don't see it modeled for us in our individualistic, anti-collectivist sort of American worldview where, exacerbated by social media or whatever. I think that there are aspects of a just peacemaking perspective in the Catholic mindset that look at my good intimately tied up with the good of others, the common good. And we've lost in a lot of, contemporary social settings, we've lost the ability to make assumptions that other people care about my well-being. Now, I don't think, we can't just blame patriarchy for that, but there are aspects of patriarchy that are rooted in domination and submission and not that kind of mutuality and mutual integrity. So I think, there's a lot of resonance there. Okay, let me go back to Jesus and turning over the tables. I don't think Jesus is militaristic in that context. Jesus is using some kind of force, although it doesn't seem to be force against bodies. Yeah. But, one of the critiques of framing Jesus as pacifist is that there was a kind of pragmatism among early followers of the Jesus movement, given their context in the Roman Empire and sort of the developing context of empire and imperialism, that had they acted, had they banded together in a kind of new governmental / militaristic force, they simply didn't have the power to have significant impact. So actually Christianity spread, according to this thinking, by emphasizing pacifism precisely because, ideally because they believed it, secondarily because of the pragmatic assumption that that is how the religion would grow, or that is how the movement would be more fruitfully shared. Because if this new social movement was perceived to be a threat to the empire had the power to squelch it. So I'm not sure if that frames the way we interpret John, given it's the latest gospel, or, I'm not sure if that helpfully pushes back against some of the claim of, well, what about Jesus's use of force? But it might kind of nuance it a bit.
Yeah. No, thank you. And yeah, and actually, I was going to say, on the note of like what's been said here, I actually think, I had 3 things, but I think I can tie them all together nicely with what has been said here. So, yeah. The issue of patriarchy that you brought up, Doc, are we going formal, or Christopher, is one of those ones where, along with the rest of the Babylonian myths that you were talking about, right, plays into what, another way in which the Genesis stories, like a kind of polemic or against those Babylonian stories, is that not only do you have that patriarchal tearing apart of the female goddess, but that that is used to found a city, and a king and a priesthood and so forth. Whereas in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 1-3, you have the intentional note, God creates humanity in a garden in direct relationship to nature, right? And not a city or class society. And part of where I'm going with this too is that in that regard, patriarchy and class society are themselves, as anthropological cross-cultural studies have borne out, they're tied together and are tied with what I see is pretty, irrefutable, that Max Weber's definition of the state as that entity which wields legitimate violence within a given territory. So we then come to this kind of issue of, is it even possible to think of a state that does not do violence? Right? In other words, is the 2-state solution even something that works? Because now you just have 2 entities that can wield legitimate violence towards each other, right? Or do we need to think more deeply in this sense of politics, and politics as building another world, right? Because I think as what you gestured to, Augustine, when he develops this, it's very significant that this is post-Constantine and post-Theodosius. Yep. That not only did Constantine in the Edict of Milan explicitly state that by adding, he was like, the more gods, the more wars we'll win. Like that literally is in the Edict of Milan. Like it wasn't like, oh, hey, I'm a Christian now. It was like, hey, as long as we tolerate this God, we got more gods on our side to kill people with. Then by the time you have Theodosius make it the official religion, it is now something that by nature does violence. So lo and behold, a few decades later, you get a theologian coming up with under what conditions should that empire do violence, right? And I think this brings us back to what you both were too religiously, but the reality of sin, and especially coming out of the Greek traditions, way of looking at it, of really as hamartia, of the missing of the mark of what we were intended to be, not just a transgression, but what we could be, back to that humanity in a garden with each other in communion. I think it's really important that we think in terms of how do we move past this? How do we do real politics? in this sense, one of the people I'm working with in my text is Jacques Rancière, a structuralist Marxist who I'm going to put in conversation with Pope Francis right now. But he's saying, like, most of what we call politics, according to Rancière, is just what he would call parapolitics, or what we often call political theater, right? That it's the reinforcement of the status quo of the nation state, of the essence of which is violence, right? So until we get back to this idea of like, well, what were we supposed to be, right? And if we even think of, and I know if there's any evolutionary biologists in the room, I know it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but our two closest relatives are the chimpanzee and the bonobo, right? And the chimpanzee is pretty fascist and violent, right? Like they almost have like a kill on sight policy to anybody that comes within their borders. The bonobo, on the other hand, is much more like the hippie commune like type sort of thing, right? And it seems to me, in that sense, like that's part of, I don't know, what I might call the image of God in us, is that we have the capacity to exercise self-discipline to become more bonobo or more chimp, or like,
That sounds right.
And in that regard, then, how might we start thinking about, politics in the deeper sense, in the sense that Rancière and others put it, of going back to what the Greeks thought of, that it's about a more just distribution of goods and status and so forth. That until we actually abolish those things, which again, I would emphasize, despite my, I think, most proven thing to like topple a government that is oppressive is actually just the general strike.
Yep.
The general strike. Everyone just saying, we're not going to work.
Yep.
You can take the whole thing down in one day if we all just wake up and do that sort of thing. Anyway, yeah.
That's why I'm pro-union. I want to say a little bit more about. I want to pick up on a little bit on your notion of can a state not be violent with regards to the two-state solution? Because this is I'm really glad you asked that question, because I've tried to think about that even in my talk and saying this is what I am arguing for, right? In part because I recognize that by creating a nation state, you are creating borders, and it's about power and maintenance of that power, right? And so, how much of the, I think part of the challenge that we face is a failure of imagination when it comes to the way we do politics, because we can feel like we can fall back on violence, right? I feel like we can fall back on doing the violence because it's easy. Like it feels right. Like I said, it is the chimpanzee, right? It is like, it feels right, and because we've told ourselves it's right, we've socialized it to feel right, and to feel like the most appropriate thing. And so I think the challenge we have, well, I'll take one step back and say, from an American political perspective, I would argue that Christians should be arguing and pushing our elected officials. So I'm talking about from a Christian theological perspective. For those of you who are not Christian, maybe you don't feel the same way. That we will, if we were to pull back the kinds of financial and other types of supports that we give, we can actually exercise persuasive power. Now, some might say I think this falls in the framework of just peacemaking and nonviolent resistance, right? Like so clearly there's consequences to doing this, but we fail when we engage Israel in particular. We don't engage Israel. We engage Israel like we're engaging another superpower, rather than the actual kind of place they have. Why do we do that, right? Why do we as a nation state engage Israel in that particular kind of way? That requires, I think, a deeper psychological evaluation. But my hunch, it is the carried trauma that I think people have, the shame and guilt that we have as a nation, as America, for what happened during the Shoah, in the ways in which we have not worked through that trauma. Similarly, And so what we have here is this way of trying to work through it and doing this way, doing one thing. And when you have these other communities, and particularly Black communities, indigenous communities that have also experienced harm, there's this denial of this harm, right? So you still see it coming back up and popping up again. And so I say that insofar to say the challenge that we have is we have to in order to foster solidarity, you have to get people to recognize they have no other choice but to work together. Right. That's it. They have no other choice but to work together. And it's so long as we as Americans run interference and say, no, we can act as this mediator where we show preference for one side over the other, then there won't be peace, because they won't have a just, the capacity to actually imagine an alternative is stifled, because then they know they can go to they can turn around to the other people and say, hey, they're not being fair. Right. And so the role that we play, I would say, is critical in this regard. You know, I believe that we have to have hope. Right. I fundamentally believe we have to have hope. I'm not a person who will go down the road of saying, you know, we need to be either what's wrong for, like, you know, if we look on a spectrum, we don't want to be kind of like this idea that the future is just inevitable. We just kind of have to just go along to get along, or this imagined like utopia optimistic, right? It's hope is actually grounded in like fear, in the sense of you have hope to avoid the future that you fear if you don't do the work. And so in this sense, hope should drive you to do the work. And that's what I feel like we lack. Like, I feel like we don't go into this situation with the actual hope that things can change. We are more or less going in with this, as America, going in with this framework of we need to enable this other country over against the other. And that, for me, is the problem in terms of the idea of a two-state solution. Even though I recognize your point that states inherently can produce violence. What are you gonna?
Actually, and I just want to literally one sentence, like going with what you're saying. Obviously, the show of guilt is there, but going also with the Marxian hermeneutics of suspicion, we have just flat out the then Senator Joe Biden in 1989 or 88 saying, if no Israel existed, we would have to create an Israel to protect our interests in the region, right? And there you have, just flat out actually admitted, this is our attack dog in the region.
Yeah.
So,
Like a political realist perspective that departs from a Christian critical realist perspective.
You don't want to select from John?
While you're looking at those, I'll say one more piece about the feminism. I didn't elaborate on this in the talk, but I appreciate the question about a critique of patriarchy is relevant here, in part because I kind of cringe drawing on Augustine positively at all. And I think it's worth noting not just his problematic approach to sexual ethics, but also the way that he talks about a lasting peace is one that's rooted in good order. And both he and Aquinas assumed a kind of natural gender hierarchy in their description of good order. So in the sense that we're drawing on Augustine and Aquinas in a revised just war framework, it needs to attend to that gender injustice. And I don't have the most ideal way to do that, but.
I think this is actually an interesting question, just to talk about the implications of just most for you, because this is, and so the question is, which, that's all, sorry. So the question is, which wars would you define as having adhered to the just war tradition? Are there any active conflicts to just wars? I think this is helpful. I think it's important for people to know the answer to this question, Dr. Reimer-Barry.
There is
That's
not,
the reason why I'm cracking up right now.
there is not a war that has met all of these criteria in human history. I think that's pretty clear. Now, Walzer and others, so that's my position, is that it's more aspirational. in terms of if we're talking about state violence and state conflict. Now, I still think it is an effective means for discussing human value towards pragmatic solidarity. And, not to just repeat what I've said before, but it's a way of holding ourselves accountable in a pluralistic society that we don't always, in a pluralistic society in which Christians are partnering with others from other religious traditions. I think it's important for us to have both grounding within Christian principles and traditions, but also some space for what we traditionally call like natural law principles, principles that appeal to right reason. And so that's part of what Augustine and Aquinas were trying to do, is to frame these principles in alignment with right reason. But it's a very effective question that I don't have an easy answer to.
I think what I appreciate about it is it's presented as a way to think through conflict and in terms of making a decision. I think the challenge is, when I taught ethics here, what I would have students to do was when they write their papers, is they have to respond to the strongest counter argument to their conclusion, right? And that's where I put the most of the weight of the paper. Like 50% of the grade was, can you actually develop a strong counter argument, not a straw man argument, but a strong counter argument to your position? And I did that because that's something that we tend to just suck at as humans. Like we want to feel that we are right, and we don't want to actually think about how we might be wrong. And I think that is that kind of maturity you have to. I'm a virtue ethicist, so I'm like, you got to foster it, right? You got to develop it. And so that's what I was trying to do in that kind of thing. And I think at its best, the just war tradition could do that if it was applied in ways that would say, how might I be wrong, right? And then how am I going to respond to those people? And I think what happens is, particularly in political power, we surround ourselves with people who tell us what we want to hear, and so that we don't actually think about how we might be wrong when we engage these situations. And that I find, that's troubling, and it's only possible in a place like America because of the power that we have and the way we do politics in this country. You don't see this happening in other smaller, less powerful, or you don't see, it's less likely to happen. One of the questions I want to actually answer, and I think is helpful for us, it's important. Part of the reason I answer is because I think we, we need to try as best to have long memories. So it's elaborate on how strategies of nonviolent resistance or peace building can be used to counter waged acts of violence that threaten one's own existence. I want to be clear about how I conceptualize the history of enslavement and Jim Crow on Black people. I want you to fundamentally understand this is and was a way in which you had a dominant white society enact strategic violence on Black bodies for hundreds of years. And especially when you're talking about resisting Jim Crow, that actually did threaten their life. And I think that's what we can't, so I think what we fail to remember, or fail to remember, is that we don't know how many people were lynched, but we know people live with the reality that they could be lynched every day. And the psychological trauma that has on people stays with you. So one of the things I talk about in my book, which is actually written on food justice, I talk a lot about the history of my grandfather, who grew up in Mississippi Delta. And he tells stories of growing up in Mississippi in the late 30s and 40s and 50s. And it sounds so similar to what you would read in Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. The thing he will not talk about, that he's gestured to just one brief moment, was lynching. He will not discuss it. And I know it's because he saw something. I know it is because of the way he reacts when he sees old white men. I know, and he just won't. He just and so I guess what I want to say is, all we have to do is look at the history of the civil rights movement to find the effective use of strategic nonviolence in making change. Is it the kind of perpetual change that made everything sunshine and rainbows? No. But if you ask my grandfather how he feels about the work of Martin Luther King, he would say that things were fundamentally different and that there were change, and he felt like he had some safeguards, some recourse that he had not had prior to the passage of civil rights laws. And he felt like more should be done, but he felt like he was particularly safer. And so one of the things I'm doing is I'm taking actually some deans and whatnot from the University of California on this pilgrimage next week to the South. And we are going to a plantation in Mississippi, and then we're going to the Equal Justice Initiative Legacy Museum in Montgomery. And so we're doing all this stuff. And so I feel like going to those places, you see what we were up against as Black people, but also what we've been able to overcome, and the ways in which you have folks who did the work of resisting in ways that forced people to see the truth of who they are. We Black people became that divine mirror to show the world the realities of Jim and Jane Crow. They could see it. They could see it on TV. They could see who they really were. And that, I think, is the value of strategic nonviolence, is you show the world who these people are, right? And so that they see it. And I mean, I would argue if you're keeping up or reading about what's the International Criminal Court case that South Africa is putting together, it is very revealing. They are being a mirror, and you just read it and you're like, whoa, they are showing the world what's happening. Now it's our choice whether or not we want to actually engage that material and see it, or if we want to turn a blind eye, right? So that's where I would say I think, when you have people who are at the brink of their own existence being threatened, and how they resisted. This question right here made me sad. But it basically says, how do we teach the children? How do we convince/teach the beautiful children of Gaza not to become the monster which they wish to destroy? And I think it's such a good question, but
I have a question for you on that. One of the things that I can't help thinking about on this is, that goes with that question is, one of the teachings we did just a couple months ago was on Abby Martin's documentary film about the Great March of Return, which was a completely Martin Luther King type inspired peaceful thing, and then met with horrific violence and spun through the media of and Israeli and U.S. politicians and media as though they were all, Hamas put them up to this so that they would, could be, and this somehow legitimized killing them. What would you say to them? That they say, we've tried this, and we just get killed, and we just get spun as the same thing, no matter what.
It's not so much what I would say to them as what I would say to us. The way this works, the way nonviolent resistance works, is you have to have support and buy-in, massive support and buy-in. This is not without cost. And I think that it requires everybody who is capable, because not everybody's capable of doing this, to be willing to have the courage to take that risk, to be out there, because how many people is it going to take to be that mirror, right? So it's not to them; they're doing the work. It's to us, and that is and that's hard. I mean, I will point you to. There's this podcast called White Lies by NPR, and it's so good. The one they did on James Rebb, who was the Unitarian Universalist pastor who was murdered in Alabama. Listen to that podcast, because that's the, what I'm saying, that white people had to be like, you know what, maybe we're the problem. That's ostensibly a lot of what it also took for movements to be able to shift and change. And it's more than that, right? I mean, it's not just that. It's also adding that voice to all the other activists that were doing that work. And so no, I mean that's a great and important question, right? And I can't sit here and say, oh, I would be out in the front lines and I'd be willing to risk my life. I cannot say that without because I don't know what I would do. But I can say I feel confident in saying that if I need to put myself in a situation to risk my life for the sanctity of others and for my family, I have no doubt that that's what I would do. Like, I have no doubt. But I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of not living. I'm not afraid of death, so.
Soapy show.
Yeah, well, I think we probably should wrap up. Yeah, because it's already 8:00. Do y'all want to say anything to?
I want to thank you all very, very much. And I want to thank this audience for being here. And I'm really grateful for everybody's support and desire to learn and to participate in the teaching.
Thank you all for being and for hanging the whole time. I know some people had to leave, but man, it's getting late. I get it. So thank you all for being here. I really enjoyed being back on campus, and I'm sure hopefully I'll be dropping by sometime soon. Thank you, Rico, for inviting me. And this is a person who actually offered me my first job here. She was my chair, so that's really cool. And so yeah, no, it's great. So thank you.